Welcome back to our read-through of the Gay Science, Book 4, and we're going to begin with 289, Embark. Quote, "Consider how every individual is affected by an overall philosophical justification of his way of living and thinking. He experiences it as a sun that shines especially for him and bestows warmth, blessings, and fertility on him. It makes him independent of praise and blame, self-sufficient, rich, liberal with happiness and goodwill. Incessantly it fashions evil into good, leads all energies to bloom and ripen, and does not permit the petty weeds of grief and chagrin to come up at all. In the end, one exclaims, 'How I wish that many such new suns were yet to be created. Those who are evil or unhappy and the exceptional human being, all these should also have their philosophy, their good right, their sunshine. What is needful is not pity for them. We must learn to abandon this arrogant fancy, however long humanity has hitherto spent learning and practicing it. What these people need is not confession, conjuring of souls, and forgiveness of sins. What is needful is a new justice, and a new watchword, and new philosophers. The moral earth, too, is round. The moral earth, too, has its antipodes. The antipodes, too, have a right to exist. There is yet another world to be discovered, and more than one. Embark, philosophers." End quote. Nietzsche returns here to a theme that he brought forward all the way at the beginning of Book 1 of the Gay Science, which involves this focus on the individual case, the peculiar case, versus what is common, gregarious, and average. The repeated theme, especially of the early books of the Gay Science, has focused on how what is gregarious, what is average, has been the determinant of the morality, the conventional morality, the traditional morality, the common morality, almost by definition, because naturally what is common to all will form up the common set of valuations, which then is articulated into a morality or a moral philosophy. And those first salvos that Nietzsche fired off in the initial aphorisms of Book 1 were critiques of this idea on the part of the average or the common values, that there are a certain set of behaviors or habits or principles that preserve the species, that are good for the security of the species, the self-preservation of mankind as it is, and that we therefore need some sort of articulated moral code, some sort of code of behavior in order to prevent or prevent immoral behaviors or habits from forming, or constrain those sorts of behaviors, those negative impulses that could be destructive to the polity, that could be threatening to the self-preservation of the community, which seems like a very basic sort of consideration to make, but what Nietzsche raises at the beginning is that no matter how human beings have acted, whether they've acted in conventionally good ways, self-abnegating ways, in a way that makes oneself a function of the herd, or whether they've acted in conventionally evil ways, in self-serving, ambitious, immoral, or destructive ways, both of these modes of living, in all the different multifarious forms that they could take, they have all advanced the species. And to go back to to quote briefly from that opening passage, quote, "I no longer know whether you, my dear fellow man and neighbor, are at all capable of living in a way that would damage the species. In other words, unreasonably and badly. What might have harmed the species may have become extinct many thousands of years ago." End quote. And further down he continues, quote, "Pursue your best or your worst desires, and above all perish. In both cases you are probably still in some way a promoter and benefactor of humanity, and therefore entitled to your eulogists, but also to your detractors." End quote. And Nietzsche explains this a few sections later as for what he might mean, insofar as he says that the strongest and most evil spirits, as he calls them, have done as much to advance humanity and to preserve humanity as the opposite types. And what he means by that, in a sense, is that, to put it very straightforwardly, they keep us on our toes. The evil people, they test us the criminal in society, or we might say the barbarians at the gates. This is what keeps us strong. It's the external pressures. It's the pressures of selection, we might even say in Darwinian terms, that the immoral or evil person puts before society or puts to society that actually invigorates society, that in a way we should be thankful for all of these evil or immoral people. And then to go back to section 1, the very first section of book 1, where Nietzsche addresses himself to the issue of the moral philosophy that might be created by these different types of people. He says that, even those with the most tragic or pessimistic view of life, who might claim in whatever terminology, whether it be Schopenhauerian terms or whether it be in explicitly religious terms, they were just as much advancing the species with their apparently life-denying morality as anyone else might be. And he says, quote, these tragedians too promote the interests of the species, even if they should believe that they promote the interest of God or work as God's emissaries. They too promote the life of the species by promoting the faith in life. Life is worth living, every one of them shouts. There is something to life. There is something behind life. Beneath it, beware, end quote. And as for what that might mean, even the most life-denying philosophy, insofar as it claims that there is something that we have to do here in our lives. We might say that, as Schopenhauerian believes, we must come to this realization of the need to negate the will, and then actively apply our will to negate the will. And because there is something behind life, there's something to it. Life is really the blind striving will, and therefore there is something to beware of, because if you are not, what might we say, attuned to this fact, and if you do not act accordingly, you're going to find yourself continuing in this suffering existence for all time. And we might say the same thing of the Christian who demands that we have a sort of religious realization, or the Buddhist who says that we have to come to a realization of the ultimate impermanence and unsatisfactoriness and emptiness of all things, and therefore, in a manner similar to Schopenhauer, because of course Schopenhauer is influenced by the Buddhists, free ourselves from that samsaric wheel. So Nietzsche is saying that in all content, these life philosophy, every single thing we do, whether it be a philosophy that negates life or a philosophy that celebrates life, whether it is a singular morality or a herd morality, whether it is a philosophy that calls for certain codes of behavior, or perhaps in the manner of the Marquis de Sade or some figures like this, attempts to abolish or circumvent all of the normal codes of behavior. Whatever the philosophy might be, all attempts to teach the purpose of existence have been in their way a seduction to life. And Nietzsche even goes so far as to say that we might have become a fantastic type of animal that might need these stories, whereas other forms of life may not have needed them. It's a new necessity that we have to fulfill, is some sort of understanding of, or some sort of purpose. And perhaps that's because we're a conscious animal. Perhaps it's a consequence of that. But ultimately, these stories about the purpose of existence, about the meaning of existence, why we might exist, what we have to do here, that there's something to life, there's something to do while you're here in life. These are all nature's way of deceiving ourselves, and to maybe draw from outside of the gay science or outside of these initial passages to explain this, we might say that consciousness is prone to these pathologies. It's one of the most, as Nietzsche says, it's sort of the newest faculty of living beings, this ability to represent ourselves to ourselves as living beings, with a perception of ourselves moving through time, existing in space as a subject in a world of objects, however we want to put it, that this realization it could be considered an error in the total economy of life, that it's the most fragile, the most vulnerable, therefore the most pathological, the most prone to mistakes of all of man's sort of bodily functions, is his conscious function. And that, in a way, illusion, or the illusion of there being a purpose for existence, could very well be the cure to these pathologies of hyper-rational consciousness that might plunge one into nihilism or something like that, that we therefore produce these enchantments of the world. We come to have this faith in the reason for why we are here. But by making this reason or this purpose or this meaning of existence, the story that we tell or the illusion that we weave, into something that is ultimately a reaction or a regulation of the consciousness, right? It's not as if that the meaning or the purpose of existence for Nietzsche in this passage is a fact that we discover out there. It's something that we create, and that, by the way, he says, life is going to continue to go on. The species is going to advance or preserve itself. Anything that could have harmed the species must have died out a long time ago. We really have no choice in the matter. Whatever we do is going to end up advancing the species. In this description, Nietzsche has made that reason for being, we might say that life philosophy or that moral philosophy that is created, into something which is not effective, something which is not active. And so one might naturally ask, what then is it? Or in what relation does it stand in the total economy of the psyche and the body and so on and so forth? And Nietzsche would say as a symptom or as a sign, as something which is ultimately, like all thoughts, like all consciousness, a reification of instinct, of impulses that rise to a particular intensity, that triumph over one another, and then are expressed in conscious language, in the moral language of the self or the subject. And so to return to this passage, 289, that we began with here in Book 4, when Nietzsche says, quote, "Those who are evil or unhappy, and the exceptional human being, all these should have their philosophy, their good right, their sunshine. What is needful is not pity for them." So the way that Nietzsche uses the metaphor of a sun in this passage is as a philosophical justification for one's existence. So again, that brings us back to these concepts in the very first book of a purpose for our existence, a reason for our being, and particularly, he says, a philosophical justification of his way of living and thinking. And so, in other words, what the story or the world enchantment that we articulate tends to be one that justifies ourselves and our way of living in the world. That might not always be the case. And in fact, in the passages subsequent to this one, Nietzsche sort of suggests there are many people who might not be able to find a sort of justification for their existence, or at least he sort of implies it, and we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. So it's not important that, or it's not the point to say that everyone lives in such a way that it's simply a self-centered affirmation of the way of life that they have, or so on and so forth. But if that's not the case, that would be because of a particular psychological pathology within that person, right? So, for example, there are people who believe in the Christian worldview and are perpetually guilty and laden with a sense of self-recrimination because they never are able to measure up to the standard, which I hesitate to say that because there are many Christians who would say no one can measure up, and therefore you shouldn't have that feeling. But that might be precisely the point then, right? That the fact that there are some people that will go into Christianity and feel perpetually sort of redeemed, right? And there's another type who's going to feel perpetually guilty. And that's going to have to do, again, with the psychological makeup of that person. Nietzsche would say if somebody has impulses that are set at odds with themselves, they're going to be more likely to be a botched kind of individual like that who can't feel themselves and their way of life to be justified within the sort of world philosophy or life philosophy that they hold. But those that do, he says that when somebody finds a philosophical justification for who and what they are, it becomes like a sun that shines just for them. And so the reason why I brought up at the beginning this divide or this dichotomy between the gregarious versus the individual case, or we might say the herd versus the individual, or the species and its genome, which it wishes to preserve as it is, versus the mutation, the hand of chance that changes, that makes the species become something new. And so, as Nietzsche said at the beginning, those exceptional types of human beings, the type of person that's typically called evil, is like that hand of chance or the random mutation or the external pressure that actually benefits the species greatly. But we've hitherto believed that everyone actually needs to get on board with the conventional moral story, or like we all need to awaken to the same moral code of valuations, the same assessment of the value and the meaning of life, or else this could derail the species or something like that. So we've actually reversed sort of what is active and what is reactive as far as impulse and thought, right? Or our consciously articulated philosophy versus the instincts, the unconscious. Because what Nietzsche would say is that the species will be advanced no matter what, but it's the way that it affects our thinking. It's the way that it affects our experience of ourselves, our consciousness. That is what our moral justification, our philosophical justification for life does. All of the sort of positive benefits that Nietzsche talks about here are mental benefits, are benefits of mood or sentiment that will be brought about if you seize upon a philosophical justification of your way of living and thinking. So I guess to recapitulate, the old understanding of all dogmatic moralities is that everyone must follow the universal moral law or else. And those who cannot find a way to justify their modus vivendi, their way of living, within this universal moral code, who cannot find that it is a sun that shines upon them, but rather a code into which they do not fit, into which they are the exception, right? And instead it becomes a very sort of dismal world for them. Well, in that case, the moralist, the dogmatic moralist, would say that is a pressure, perhaps a social pressure or a pressure of conscience on that individual to conform to the herd morality, as Nietzsche would call it. So we need to get everyone on board with the right morals. And, these people that Nietzsche would call outright evil or exceptions to the rule, whatever sort of sting of conscience they may feel or the ways in which they might be botched by that, being a square peg in the round hole of that morality, however we want to put it, that's good because that's a way of shaping them into that instrument of the common good, of the commonwealth. But Nietzsche affects this reversal where he says it's all instinct or impulse. The conscious articulation of what that impulse signifies into moral language is a post hoc explanation. It's reactive in that manner. And to the extent that it affects us, it affects our consciousness. And far from the necessity of adopting one particular narrative or another, all of them advance or preserve the species in their own way. And so, unlike the moral dogmatists, Nietzsche hopes, I hope they all find their sun. I hope they all come to a philosophical justification for their way of living. They don't just adopt the one that's been handed down to them, which might not be suited for them. Everyone should find their philosophy. Everyone should find their good right, their sunshine. He says he wishes for many new suns to be created. And the way he ends the passage, where he says the moral earth too is round. The moral earth too has its antipodes, and the antipodes have a right to exist. There's yet another world to be discovered, and more than one. This refers back to the sort of Columbus imagery, once again, of setting sail from the city that Nietzsche's in, Genoa, and discovering a new world. And so to apply this to the moral, he's explicitly saying that I'm using this sea voyage across the globe to discover a new geographical world. I am using that as a metaphor for something that could happen in morality, that we sail around to the other side of the moral earth and discover an antipodal morality, which has just as much of a right to exist as our own. And this could open up a whole new world for us. And therefore, what is needful is not pity for all the people who do not fit into the conventional moral justifications for life, the conventional purpose of existence as it is taught. Because, you might think of Nietzsche as saying the evil people are of value too, the criminal is of value too, the hostile person with the antipodal morality to yours is of value to you as well, that we should perhaps pity someone or be forgiving towards them when they find themselves ground under by a society that wishes to botch them and grind them under for, posing a threat to it, because that's always what the herd morality does. But he says, no, we do not need pity for them. This is part of Nietzsche's career-long campaign against pity. And oftentimes I think people misunderstand where this comes from, because they think this, Nietzsche just wants to be a cruel Conan the Barbarian type figure and create philosophers of the future who are like that. Certainly, as we've seen, he does not make a moral condemnation on such a figure. But I think it's very important to remember that Nietzsche himself is one of these types that could be described, the exceptional type of person who does not fit in with the conventional morality, the conventional stories or narratives about the purpose of existence. And he's also somebody who experiences a great deal of pain in his life due to his medical condition. And I think people who are perpetually sick like that, or people who are disabled, the last thing they want is to be pitied. And that's a very interesting thing, because we make pity such a central, value in our religious and moral life because of Christianity. We think it's a very good thing to show to others, but pretty much nobody wants it to be shown to them. Anyone with a sense of pride or dignity in themselves does not want to be pitied. And so it's very strange that we think it's good to be pitying towards others, because we don't want it for ourselves. But so this is why Nietzsche says we need a new justice. And here, we've spoken extensively about this on the podcast in the past, but I think it'd be good to refer to Heraclitus's aphorism that strife is justice. That oftentimes the conflict in the world, the suffering in the world, the dissatisfaction, pain, and just all of these aspects of the human condition, the strife of the human condition, is posed as a sort of condemnation upon it, or something that must be justified in order for life to have value. That was the way that Heraclitus's predecessor, Anaximander, thought of things, that all things come into being as a sort of theft from the absolute, that they therefore must pay penance, they must make up for the injustice of that theft by passing away. So all things that arise, it's an act of injustice. Justice is restored when things pass away, which would imply that a purely just state of affairs would be, nothing existing, we might say. Whereas Heraclitus says quite the opposite, that justice is the existence of these many striving, competing, conflicting forces in the world. That all things come into being through war and through strife and through conflict, and therefore, if we were to remove that element of strife, there would be no existence at all. It's only insofar as there is becoming that we can say that things exist or appear to us. And we might also think of Nietzsche's comments in Birth of Tragedy, that one of the sort of the mysteries of the Dionysia was that they involved an experience with the primordial pain and contradiction, as he calls it, that pain begets existence, that in childbirth itself and procreation, there is pain, there is suffering. There's therefore suffering, we might say, strife at the root of things coming into being once again. But if one celebrates life and affirms life, then one therefore justifies the pain on account of the value of life rather than devaluing life on account of the pain involved with it. All of this takes us a bit afield from the way that Nietzsche is using the term justice in this passage. But it does relate insofar as we might say the strife between competing moral perspectives, competing philosophical justifications for life, those antipodal perspectives on the moral earth, the opposite poles of this moral earth, as Nietzsche has described it, that it might be justice in itself for them to be different, for them to be conflicting, rather than demanding that they have to harmonize or synthesize or all come under the purview of one universal dogmatic moral interpretation of the world. And so when Nietzsche concludes by saying, "Embark, philosophers," what he's calling on us to do is to go out and find that sun, that way of viewing life that justifies our way of thinking and living within life. And not because that he thinks that one of these moral justifications for life is going to be correct, that it will solve the problems of philosophy or something like that. Rather, this is an exhortation to a sort of pagan in the sense of being polytheist view of the moral philosophies that mankind invents. And as a final note, we might think of the way that he uses the metaphor of the sun in the God is dead passage, that the God idea was like a sun to mankind. So we're going to go out on these voyages across the moral earth, sort of spilling out across all of these different directions, all of these sort of experimental routes, or all these sort of undiscovered countries and wildernesses as philosophers, and discover many new suns. And with this, I think we can move on to 290, because that aphorism more or less continues the train of thought that Nietzsche has already begun with this, with his comments in 289. So Nietzsche says here, quote, "One thing is needful, to give style to one's character, a great and rare art. It is practiced by those who survey all the strengths and weaknesses of their nature and then fit them into an artistic plan until every one of them appears as art and reason, and even weaknesses delight the eye. Here a large mass of second nature has been added. There a piece of original nature has been removed, both times through long practice and daily work at it. Here the ugly that could not be removed is concealed. There it has been reinterpreted and made sublime. Much that is vague and resisted shaping has been saved and exploited for distant views. It is meant to beckon toward the far and immeasurable. In the end, when the work is finished, it becomes evident how the constraint of a single taste governed and formed everything large and small. Whether this taste was good or bad is less important than one might suppose, if only it was a single taste. It will be the strong and domineering natures that enjoy their finest gaiety in such constraint and perfection under a law of their own. The passion of their tremendous will relents in the face of all stylized nature, of all conquered and serving nature. Even when they have to build palaces and design gardens, they demur at giving nature freedom. Conversely, it is the weak characters without power over themselves that hate the constraint of style. They feel that if this bitter and evil constraint were imposed upon them, they would be demeaned. They become slaves as soon as they serve. They hate to serve. Such spirits, and they may be of the first rank, are always out of shape and interpret their environment as free nature. Wild, arbitrary, fantastic, disorderly, and surprising. And they are well advised, because it is only in this way that they can give pleasure to themselves. For one thing is needful, that a human being should attain satisfaction with himself, whether it be by means of this or that poetry or art. Only then is a human being at all tolerable to behold. Whoever is dissatisfied with himself is continually ready for revenge, and we others will be his victims, if only by having to endure his ugly sight. For the sight of what is ugly makes one bad and gloomy." End quote. And so you might notice that Nietzsche has said one thing is needful in this passage, which is not to give style to one's character. That is, those are the words that follow directly after the title, one thing is needful. But the title of the aphorism refers to what he says at the end, one thing is needful, that a human being should attain satisfaction with himself, by whatever means. And Kaufman seems to think this is, he's like, the themes of 289 are taken up in the next section, but what he says is needful is different from there, where he gives three things. He says what's needful is a new justice and a new watchword and new philosophers, as he says in 289, whereas in 290 he says it's to attain satisfaction with yourself. And I think to explain the difference here, they are related passages, but Nietzsche's clearly talking about what's needful for them, for others, for the people around us. What's needful for us in regard to them, we might say. That's what he's talking about in the previous passage, because he says, what is needful is not pity for them, referring to the people who are evil, exceptional, and happy, so on and so forth, right? What we need is a new justice and how we regard them as useful for preserving or advancing the species, because the strife they bring is creative. A new watchword, which we could say is, new language for discussing these ideas, for discussing competing moral justifications for life. And Nietzsche comes up with a number of new watchwords. I don't think there's just one. And then new philosophers. We need many types of life philosophy. We need this, again, polytheistic understanding of morality or something like that. And so that's, in a way, what's needful for our feelings or the way that we experience the competing world pictures offered by other people, something like that. What Nietzsche is saying in this passage is that what is needful for us, for how we see ourselves, is to attain satisfaction with ourselves. And perhaps the way to do that is to give style to one's character, to organize everything in an artistic plan, as he says, until everything appears as artful and reasonable within oneself. And it's very interesting to compare this passage to what he said just in the previous book in Daybreak, where he was speaking of how to deal with vehement drives, where he says explicitly at the end of that passage, whichever of these strategies that you adopt in order to minimize or contain or propitiate a drive within you, if it is successful, that is not because your reason has actually organized everything. It's because one drive has triumphed over another. He says, in fact, it is never our reason that is the organizing force. It is always a drive that has become master and is using reason as a tool or as a weapon, we might say. And so here Nietzsche sort of suggests that many of the people who become satisfied with themselves do so because what allows them to give style to their character is that a single taste governs. So we might say one ruling impulse or one ruling thought of a given drive, as Nietzsche will later speak in that language in Beyond Good and Evil. And therefore, the trait that is most helpful in giving style to your character is really obedience. It's not actually sort of what we might think of like stereotypically sort of like wild, creative, artistic freedom to do whatever you want. That's not really what art is. I mean, I know there's certain forms of abstract art or postmodern art that could be perhaps described that way, but really, I mean, you have to obey many of the rules in order to create an artistic product. You have to learn the rules, and you work within your creativity is expressed within those rules. I mean, music and music theory is a wonderful example of this. And even if people don't know the actual music theory, like if you play guitar and you just know the shapes, the patterns that you're using, that's still within you're still learning a set of rules. You're still learning what the associations are between the notes, which are mathematical, which are geometric intervals, really, and learning what sounds those produce or what moods are produced but when certain tones follow others. And even the most abstract forms of music like jazz ultimately require an in-depth knowledge of the rules in order to express your creativity. But so in any case, when Nietzsche talks about giving style to yourself, turning yourself into, frankly, a work of art, working upon yourself as an artist, what is required is obedience. And obedience to what? To one ruling taste. And what is that taste? Is it the triumph of an impulse? Perhaps it's a conflux or a sort of a confluence of impulses. I mean, Nietzsche's not an essentialist, so he doesn't essentialize the self, but he doesn't even essentialize the will or the drives. They're not really things so much as events. But that one ruling taste could perhaps be multiple. It could perhaps be multifarious. But insofar as it can produce an aesthetic or a vibe or something like that, a certain feeling or a certain tonality of the soul that is sufficiently motivating to you, that it can guide you, and to which, if you can obey that sort of motivating taste, that impulse or set of impulses, if you can obey that, Nietzsche says that's a sign of a strong and domineering nature, right? Knowing how to obey is the sign of a strong nature. And that, in fact, it is those who are weak, he says, weak characters without power over themselves, that hate the constraint of style. They're slaves whenever they're forced to serve. They hate to serve. They're not willing to serve the ruling impulse of their taste. And the ending is very interesting because it sort of suggests that whether or not one is given style to their character according to one ruling taste or according to this idea of wild freedom, total creative, arbitrary freedom, they're going to experience the external world differently, because there's this notion that whatever the external world might be, it comes to us through our own experiences, and the way, whatever, to use the language of the previous passage, whatever sun is shining above us, however we interpret those experiences, is going to affect not just the judgments we make about the world, but what the world itself is. And so his comments about, they're always out to shape and interpret their environment as free nature, as wild, arbitrary, fantastic, and disorderly, and surprising. That's the sign of a weak nature, right? But that sort of judgment aside that Nietzsche is making, one's experience of what nature will be like is going to itself be a reflection of their own impulses, because ultimately we're not directly touching nature. It's coming to us mediated through our impulses, through our nerves, through our organs, and through the conscious apparatus. And so it's very interesting in light of the whole project that Nietzsche has sort of brought forward in the gay science, because again, it's got that grounding in science, in uncovering what is necessary in the world and in nature, uncovering those necessities, and as Nietzsche says, trying to look for what is beautiful in them. Well, that's quite the opposite of viewing nature as wild, arbitrary, fantastic, and so on. Viewing nature as just a totally chaotic product of chance, which is frankly not how Nietzsche views nature. Again, he's not a mechanist because of these concerns about, the rejection of causality, and also the sort of his phenomenological views, we might say. But he would say that it's a reflection of a stronger nature to see the necessities in outside, external nature to ourselves. That a person of stronger character, who has disciplined himself to wholeness, as he says of Goethe, who might be an example of somebody who's given style to his character, they're going to tend to see the world in terms of its laws, its patterns, its necessities, because they're the types who are willing to obey when appropriate. That paradoxically speaking, it is the ones who are most free who are going to be the most honest and sober in seeing the necessities of life, and that those who feel themselves the ones who are weak and therefore feel their will constrained and halted and impotent at every turn, will paradoxically be the ones to interpret nature as a free and wild thing, to see the external world as free and wild, just as they prefer to see themselves, again, perhaps as a sort of psychological compensation. And that, I think, covers most of the content of this passage, but I think it's very interesting, again, to compare it to the previous one, because we have a clear distinction between he who can be satisfied with himself versus he who is continually dissatisfied with himself. And he says, whoever's continually dissatisfied with himself is always ready for revenge, and we will be his victims. This is a clear prefiguration of the genealogy, of the idea of ressentiment, of the vindictiveness of the weak and impotent, something like that. The idea that weakness corrupts, we might say. And Nietzsche says even just the ugly sight of them is a sort of revenge upon the world, a revenge upon all of us, because it makes the rest of us bad and gloomy. But in any case, he does say those weak natures who have to see everything, and have to shape and interpret their environment as free nature, right? That is their way of giving pleasure to themselves, of being satisfied with themselves. So even though it is a way that is only befitting of a weak and impotent type of person, it's nevertheless something needful for them. And thus that sort of brings us back to these initial considerations, that whatever way that we are going to end up seeing the world, to put it in just the crudest terms, is always going to reflect what is needful for us. Whether one is strong or weak, we might say they could be well turned out or badly turned out in either case. Nietzsche says they could be souls of the first rank, but still be sort of slavish spirits. And then there might be weak and impotent people who nevertheless have a way of viewing the world that justifies it to themselves and allows them to celebrate themselves and their life within it. And so you could have, it's like a very strange thing to consider that you could have, if it's only a matter of strong and weak wills, you could have thwarted strong wills and life-affirming weak wills. And meanwhile, you might say the norm might be for strong wills to be life-affirming and for weak wills to be thwarted and dissatisfied with themselves. And so we might say that this perhaps provides a distinction between health and sickness versus weakness and strength. That these are, after all, intensely related terms in the work of Nietzsche, but perhaps this is a key way of understanding the difference. That strength and weakness just sort of refer to an overall quantity of power, if we might be so vulgar as to think that power could be quantized. And health and sickness really refer to one's ability or inability to be satisfied with themselves as they are according to their own strength or their weakness. And so, in physiological terms, it's very easy to understand. Somebody could be born with genetics that, they're destined to be 6'3" and broad-shouldered and have plenty of endurance and all of these things. But, they fall ill and it weakens them. Maybe, like Nietzsche, served in the army and then contracted multiple diseases while serving as a nurse orderly on the front lines. And he already sort of had a medical condition, so it just made him worse. But that affected his breathing for the rest of his life. And so you can be very naturally strong and nevertheless become sick. And similarly, you could be very naturally weak, but be healthy in your weakness or something like that. And I do want to bring in a note from outside the gay science, just briefly here at the end of analyzing this aphorism, especially as a rebuttal to the strength fetishists of Nietzsche, who might say that no, health and strength are really the same thing. There's no distinction to be made here. And I don't think that's true. And this is an unpublished note that was written at the same time as the gay science, where Nietzsche writes, quote, "My doctrine teaches, live in such a way that you must desire to live again. This is your duty. You will live again in any case. He for whom striving procures the highest feeling, let him strive. He for whom repose procures the highest feeling, let him rest. He for whom belonging, following, and obeying procures the highest feeling, let him obey, provided that he becomes aware of what procures the highest feeling and that he shrinks back from nothing. Eternity depends upon it," end quote. And so there's sort of this notion that, whatever it is that you find out, when you become who you are, when you find out who you are, you should live in such a way as to, that is in accord with that understanding of who you are, and hopefully celebrates and affirms who you are. And I think this could even include as he says, Nietzsche has no respect for those who seek only repose, right? But he says, if that's where you find your highest feeling, then let that person rest. Let them repose. Now, would Nietzsche say that we should necessarily follow the valuations or the philosophical narrative that a person with such instincts that they want only to repose, should we trust the story that they craft about the world? Well, all stories are in some sense errors, right? Again, consciousness being an error in the total economy of life. But we should be aware when such a story or such a valuation comes from declining instincts or when it comes from ascending instincts. But for one, that's quite another matter of whether or not that person is able to be satisfied with themselves, which Nietzsche says is the most needful thing for us on an individual level, on an existential level, we might say. And secondly, because he said he seeks many suns, he hopes many new experiments will be, philosophical and moral experiments will be conducted, many new valuations and tablets of values created, a sun to shine for every different type of person. In some sense, it doesn't matter because he's wishing for an end of the days when we only have this monistic, singular, universalist moral philosophy. Because that dogmatism, Nietzsche would say, always comes out of, again, what is common to all, what is gregarious, which are ultimately going to be those values that always refer us back to being an instrument of the herd, of the collective. And the only real justification for that is that it will preserve the species. But If that's not true, if we don't need a correct moral narrative to preserve the species, then we can suffer there to be many different types of philosophical justification. So to refer back to the initial aphorism of this book, of Book 4, when Nietzsche says, I do not want to accuse, I do not want to wage war against what is ugly, looking away will be my only negation. We have to keep that in mind with this passage here. There will be those who are ugly physically or just ugly in their life philosophy and their way of living, and we don't need to make war on that. We can simply pass by them. And so with that, we'll move on to 291, entitled Genoa. Quote, for a long time now I have been looking at this city, at its villas and pleasure gardens, and the far-flung periphery of its inhabited heights and slopes. In the end, I must say, I see faces that belong to past generations. This region is studded with the images of bold and autocratic human beings. They have lived and wish to live on. That is what they are telling me with their houses, built and adorned to last for centuries, and not for a fleeting hour. They were well disposed toward life, however ill-disposed they often may have been toward themselves. I keep seeing the builders, their eyes resting on everything near and far that they have built, and also on the city, the sea, and the contours of the mountains, and there is violence and conquest in their eyes. All this they want to fit into their plan and ultimately make their possession by making it part of their plan. The whole region is overgrown with this magnificent, insatiable selfishness of the lust for possessions and spoils. And even as these people refuse to recognize any boundaries in distant lands and, thirsting for what was new, placed a new world beside the old one. Each rebelled against each at home, too, and found a way to express his superiority and to lay between himself and his neighbor his personal infinity. Each once more conquered his homeland for himself by overwhelming it with his architectural ideas and refashioning it into a house that was a feast for his eyes. In the north, one is impressed by the law and the general delight in lawfulness and obedience as one contemplates the way cities are built. One is led to guess at the ways in which, deep down, people posited themselves as equal and subordinated themselves. That must have been what was dominant in the souls of all builders. But what you find here, upon turning any corner, is a human being apart, who knows the sea, adventure, and the Orient, a human being who abhors the law and the neighbor as a kind of boredom, and who measures everything old and established with envious eyes. With the marvelous cunning of his imagination, he would like to establish all of this anew, at least in thought, and put his hand to it and his meaning into it, if only for the moments of a sunny afternoon when his insatiable and melancholy soul does feel sated for once, and only what is his and nothing alien may appear to his eyes." End quote. So before we get into the things that Nietzsche's saying about the way that the architecture of Genoa speaks to him, there is a very clear analogy, I think, that Nietzsche, given where this aphorism appears in relation to the two that just came before it, when Nietzsche says all they want to fit into their plan and ultimately make their possession by making it part of their plan. And this was just what Nietzsche was talking about in terms of giving style to one's character, making everything about oneself fit one artistic pattern, one artistic plan. This is how Nietzsche imagines the builders of all these great old houses in Genoa, designed to last for generations instead of for the moment. And this is why he sees the images of bold and autocratic human beings. They're autocratic in the way the artist is autocratic with his vision. Or we might think of the way a director is autocratic in that during the auteur era of the film, at least in America, it was said that the closest thing to a dictator in the modern world was the film director. And so this is why Nietzsche says he sees violence and conquest in their eyes, that there's something autocratic and dictatorial, something tyrannical about that ruling impulse that gives style, the voice of one's taste or whatever it might be. And here we're seeing the architecture of these old houses as a sort of a physical metaphor for giving style to one's character. And so what does Nietzsche say about them? Well, it's almost as if the architecture of Genoa reflects the kind of explorer spirit or frontier spirit of, again, Columbus. These are the houses of they who know the sea and adventure and distant lands. And this is in contrast to the houses, the architecture of the North that sort of reveals, it's like a sign or a symptom that reveals something, right? In the same way that our philosophy or the sun that we discover or create that shines upon us as a sign or a symptom of sort of the ruling impulse within us. The impulse revealed in the architecture of the North, Nietzsche says, a delight in lawfulness and obedience, if one contemplates the way that the cities there are built. And I'm not going to weigh in on these artistic evaluations of Nietzsche's. What's important to note is the way in which it mirrors his typical remarks about Northern Europe versus Southern Europe, or the way he speaks about the Renaissance of Italy versus the German Reformation. And so I can't help but wonder if some of the aesthetic judgments that Nietzsche's making here about what's revealed in the architecture is already, even if there is something to it, if it's just reflecting a series of cultural traits he's already assigned to the North and the South, or to the Germans versus the Italians. But that those set of associations, it is important because it reveals much in the way that Nietzsche thinks about the nature of, well, might we say, like there's an interesting thing in this dichotomy between the Northern Europeans as sort of the more rational, the more lawful and obedient, and more sort of devoted to the herd morality, the community morality, and thus more in line with the spirit of the Middle Ages, more spiritual in the way of being more intellectual and also more religious, versus the Italian type, South, the people who are very individual and peculiar, or they're just more of the different types of individuals who, as Nietzsche says, feel themselves to be apart, as though an infinity separates himself from his neighbor. Sort of, the notion that during the Italian Renaissance you have all of these geniuses and remarkable characters, peculiar types of people, versus, say, the more gregariously minded Germans. And that this is what is produced in sort of the hothouse of the anarchistic state of nature that was the Italian Renaissance, of these brutal rivalries of city versus city, and therefore their religion is sort of like a series of aesthetics and like a sort of masquerade. It's not really there's no genuine religiosity in the sense of wanting to perfectly or sincerely cohere oneself to the religious law. It's more sort of the culture of indulgences that commit the sin and then ask for forgiveness later. But in any case, so we have that North and South dichotomy here, but we also have that idea, that metaphor, that allegory of the architectural style as an artistic rendering of one's ruling impulse, in the same way that one might give style to one's character. This is sort of an example of that, or an analogy for that. Let's go to 292. Quote, "To those who preach morals, I do not wish to promote any morality, but to those who do, I give this advice. If you wish to deprive the best things and states of all honor and worth, then go on talking about them as you have been doing. Place them at the head of your morality, and talk from morning to night of the happiness of virtue, the composure of the soul, of justice and imminent retribution. The way you are going about it, all these good things will eventually have popularity and the clamor of the streets on their side. But at the same time, all the gold that was on them will have been worn off by so much handling, and all the gold inside will have turned to lead. Truly, you are the masters of alchemy in reverse, the devaluation of what is most valuable. Why don't you make the experiment of trying another prescription to keep from attaining the opposite of your goal, as you have done hitherto? Deny these good things. Withdraw the mob's acclaim from them, as well as their easy currency. Make them once again concealed secrets of solitary souls. Say that morality is something forbidden. That way you might win over for these things the kind of people who alone matter. I mean those who are heroic. But to that end, there has to be a quality that inspires fear and not, as hitherto, nausea. Hasn't the time come to say of morality what Master Eckhart said? I ask God to rid me of God." End quote. So the way Meister Eckhart said, I wish God to rid me of God, we should ask, by implication, morality to rid us of morality. So the self-overcoming of morality. And there are various ways in which Nietzsche talks about the self-overcoming of morality, but what does that mean in this context, really? Well, as Nietzsche says, by making morality forbidden, it would become heroic to practice it, to have a moral code and be a moral person. If you were to forbid everyone from having a moral code, thinking morally, being a moral person, it's not very clear how you could do that in practical terms, but we can at least entertain the thought that if you could practically ban morality, it would require heroism in order to be a moral person. And so we might consider the notion that, so for example, how could you have integrity? How could you have the moral fortitude to hold to your ideals even when no one is there to watch you or hold you to account if you were always being watched? That might be an argument for why in perhaps a theistic world, a monotheistic world, in which God has made a bunch of moral demands upon his subjects, it can never really be clear whether they're adhering to that morality, the divine code of morality, because they actually want to, because they actually see the good in following that moral code, and they've consciously assented to it, or because they're simply God-fearing. They're just avoiding the punishment of that God, we might say. But similarly, as Nietzsche has pointed out throughout this entire text, there is an incentive to adopt the collective morality, which is part of the power of the collective, we might say. The way in which everyone is incentivized to instrumentalize himself, make himself into a function of the herd, because the herd has immense power. And those values of the collective are inculcated to us over long generations, over the process of being enculturated into the society, until those values take the form of conscience, until we even hear the voice of the collective inside of our head, and we feel guilt whenever that Nietzsche thinks is sort of like a, what might we say, like a rarefaction of the fear that one feels, of the wrath of the collective. Whenever they transgress against the collective morals, then we sort of punish ourselves with guilt. So in any case, it's yes, many people might articulate a code of morals and may even, consciously speaking, believe in them. And here we mean a code of morals that matches the conventional or the traditional code of morals, the widely, commonly accepted code of morals of all those around them. But it can never really be clear whether that morality is something that they hold out of integrity, out of an actual conviction, out of an actual belief, because in other words, they're actually a moral person, as we might say. Or is it simply because those are the beliefs of everyone around them? And in a very real sense, you could say, most people therefore never really think about those beliefs. That many of the presumptions or premises upon which our society is based are taken for granted to the point where people wouldn't even know to critique or dispute them or even question them. But the fact of the matter is that people who do openly question the deep values of our culture and the conventional morality, who break from it in real and concrete terms, are met with immense pressures from the broader collective. I think this is just a practical reality, whether it's ostracism, whether it's just other forms of social pressure. I mean, if you express views that are sufficiently outside of the Overton window, that are sufficiently fringe and radical, you could perhaps be fired from your job, you could perhaps be debanked. There are certain opinions that go so far that they may even be illegal in one country or another, or even in many countries. And so it's never a heroic decision, or it's not a decision that requires heroism to simply uphold the values that everyone else already upholds, everyone all around you already agrees with. That's never a difficult or hard decision. That's the easy decision. You'll only see if somebody is really moral, in the sense of voluntarily and consciously embracing and affirming this moral code and upholding that conviction even when it's difficult, because that's the only time when it really matters, is when your morals are tested, when you are put in a moral dilemma. That's never the hard decision. It's the easy decision to capitulate to what everyone else already believes. And so in a way we could say that many of the points or the questions that Nietzsche has raised, the possibilities that Nietzsche has raised throughout this text, are appealing to a certain type of reader precisely because they are the opposite of what most people conventionally believe, because it would then require heroism to uphold them. It would be the difficult decision to go against the grain of your entire society and its pre-existing morality. And as we went over at the beginning, it's almost like a precondition of Nietzsche's thought that whatever is common or average or mediocre is of no value, and whatever is singular or rare or extraordinary is of the only thing that has value, is of the supreme value. And so moralism, hitherto, the moral dogmatists enact this reverse alchemy by taking something that is valuable, because somebody who truly had moral convictions and held to them, who held to their virtue even when it was difficult to do so, is someone that Nietzsche would say is worthy of respect. There's something incredibly powerful about that, and incredibly inspiring, and potentially, you need people like that in order to accomplish things in this world, right? Where there will always be forces opposing you. If you have a conviction and you want to enact it, and an ideal you want to enact it, you need people who will be willing to adhere to that ideal even when it is difficult or when it requires sacrifices in order to do so. So there's a real reason why we respect that kind of conviction. But by making it common, you deprive people of the heroism of that position. All the heroism is found in Nietzsche's immoralism, because it's sort of the position of the exception. Because by universalizing things and making them common to all, you make them cheap. You make them of no value. And again, that's not really something Nietzsche argues for here. It's, again, like a precondition of what he's arguing. But if you agree with him, even on some sort of intuitive level, then the point that he's making is that morality is going to, overcome itself by effectively just becoming an accepted series of everyday commonplace habits that are just understood to be for the instrumental benefit of the broader community. There's no heroism involved with it. It's just sort of a set of utilitarian considerations for the functioning of the broader social order. There's no nobility in that. There's nothing transformative or creative in that. It's simply morality at that point just becomes being a functionary of a system. And so perhaps those who have a real, if they're the kind of person who wants to be, who wants to hold the heroic moral conviction, perhaps they'll go over to Nietzsche's sort of strange kind of anti-morality in order to hold that position and test their convictions. Maybe. But, ultimately, as Nietzsche says at the beginning, he's not trying to promote any morality. So even though he said at the beginning of the passage we started with this week of, I hope many such new suns will be discovered, many different new philosophical justifications for life, and therefore many new moralities, he's not taking up as a partisan for any one of them. He's excited for the possibility of many new moralities, in whatever form that they take, but he's not looking for any particular one. And so his advice to any of us is to, again, it's very polytheistic in this way. He's saying, keep your value a secret, keep it the property of a closed-off sphere of the sacred or something like that, not for everyone. It's again just a rebelliousness against this gregarious tastes or against dogmatism or universalism. This whole systematic theoretical way of thinking that tries to basically solve the problems for man as an abstraction of all humankind, when Nietzsche's focus is on the great diversity of mankind, the great individuality within all the different ways that man can live and experience the phenomenon of life, and therefore all the different ways that we can craft moralities and metaphysics to justify life or to give us a purpose for our existence. And in a truly polytheistic fashion or a truly pagan fashion, he imagines a better sort of world in which there are multiple competing, clashing, different sort of cults of morality, we might say. That this will be an overcoming of this monistic worldview that cheapens morality, ultimately. Let's move on to 293, quote, "Our heir. We know very well how science strikes those who merely glance at it in passing as if they were walking by, as women do, and unfortunately also many artists. The severity of its service, its inexorability in small as in great matters, and the speed of weighing and judging matters and passing judgment makes them feel dizzy and afraid. Above all, they are terrified to see how the most difficult is demanded and the best is done, without praise and decorations. Indeed, what one hears is, as among soldiers, mostly reproaches and harsh rebukes, for doing things well is considered the rule and failure is the exception, but the rule always seems to keep quiet. This severity of science has the same effect as the forms and good manners of the best society. It is frightening for the uninitiated. But those who are used to it would never wish to live anywhere else than in this bright, transparent, vigorous, electrified air, in this virile air. Anywhere else things are not clean and airy enough for them. They suspect that elsewhere their best art would not really profit others, nor give real delight to themselves, that among misunderstandings half of their lives would slip through their fingers, that they would be required to exercise a great deal of caution, conceal things, be inhibited, so many ways of losing a lot of strength for no good reason. But in this severe and clear element they have their full strength. Here they can fly. Why, then, go down into those muddy waters where one has to swim and wade to get one's wings dirty? No, it is too hard for us to live there. It is our fault that we were born for the air, clean air, we rivals of the beams of light, and that we wish we could ride on ethereal dust specks like these beams, not away from the sun, but toward the sun. That, however, we cannot do. Let us therefore do what alone we can do, bring light to the earth, be the light of the earth. And to that end, we have our wings and our speed and severity. For this are we virile and even terrible, like fire. Let those be terrified by us who do not know how to gain warmth and light from us." End quote. So a really nice passage in terms of the prose. But I think, it's very sort of straightforward what Nietzsche is saying here, that our heir, right? When he's speaking to we, he's talking to we adherents of the gay science. It's the very, again, this is not the worldview of the artist in which might see chance or wild nature in everything, or chaos in everything, or, again, the type he was speaking of that, I guess he wasn't correlating it with the artist, but the kind of the arbitrary, chaotic freedom of the person who has no control over himself, who is not able to obey, right? That there is something, again, lawful that we see in the world, that we see the necessities in nature, that this is very much grounded in a scientific attitude toward the world. It's very important that Nietzsche changes the vibe of science, the sentiments behind science, but it's every bit as severe as science in the way that, as Nietzsche says, it's not a forgiving world. But it's interesting the way that Nietzsche describes it. Again, he uses the word virile 2 times. And remember, he says in the earlier section in Book 4, in Preparatory Men, he welcomes all signs that a more virile and warlike age is coming. And he hopes that this will bring heroism, there's that word again, into knowledge. He just spoke about bringing heroism into morality by perhaps forbidding morality. Again, not a literal suggestion, but sort of a way of thinking about what it does when morality is universally held. And so, in that passage, he's talking about bringing heroism into knowledge, and live dangerously, but specifically as regards the questions of knowledge. Well, here he sees that virility once again in the bright, transparent, vigorous, electrified air of the mindset of the scientist, the joyful scientist. And I think, much like the pre-Socratics, Nietzsche is, especially at this phase, he does think it's a noble calling to. It's perhaps the highest prizes, the greatest treasure awaits you in the realm of knowledge, and this unforgiving plunge into the empirical study of the world in order to know what it is that governs this material reality. What are the necessities by which the material world behaves and becomes? And, for all of Nietzsche's dismissal of the power of the consciousness or the power of thought to encapsulate reality, his constant reminders that our thought is not that we don't have this access to a mind-independent reality, that our thought is not a perfect mirroring or a correspondence or even an imperfect correspondence with the outside world. But no, all we know is is impressions, sense impressions into our nervous system, which are then represented, and that we then create signs for in language, therefore sort of equivocating a series of sounds or a series of letters with what is effectively like the representation of a feeling. And yet, within that sort of metaphysical understanding, or we might say anti-metaphysical understanding, nevertheless, the scientific mindset within that kind of world, the world of pure appearance, recognizing that what you are seeing is nothing more than appearance. The most noble and virile calling is that of the scientist. And, not for everybody. Nietzsche makes it clear it's for a certain type of person who wishes they could ride on light as though they were an ethereal speck of dust. And, presumably that's not the temperament or the vibe, the sentiment of every type of person. But Nietzsche says for those that are like this, they should be the light of the earth instead of a saintly or a prophet figure or a messiah figure. So those who try to understand nature, who do understand nature, perhaps those who understand it enough to harness the power of nature, that type of endeavor it's the most fertile ground for the new pursuits of knowledge. And so, I think just a celebration of the values of science here. All right, let's go on to 294. Quote, "Against the slanderers of nature, I find those people disagreeable in whom every natural inclination immediately becomes a sickness, something that disfigures them or is downright infamous. It is they that have seduced us to hold that man's inclinations and instincts are evil. They are the cause of our great injustice against our nature, against all nature. There are enough people who might well entrust themselves to their instincts with grace and without care, but they do not, from fear of this imagined evil character of nature. That is why we find so little nobility among men, for it will always be the mark of nobility that one feels no fear of oneself, expects nothing infamous of oneself, flies without scruple where we feel like flying, we free-born birds. Wherever we may come, there will always be freedom and sunlight around us." End quote. So we, again, Nietzsche addressing his own cohort here, the free spirits, the philosophers of the future, the provincial, the night poets, right, of the future. That's who Nietzsche is addressing here, and he says he attributes nobility to this group. And what he says about nobility, the reason why it's so lacking among modern man, is this distrust of nature, this slander of nature, which obviously we've discussed this ad nauseum on the podcast, but Christianity is the great slanderer of nature, even though now that slander persists in secularized valuations. The morality of Christianity continues on, even if it isn't always in the literal Christian form. But, as we discussed in previous read-throughs, Nietzsche implies it would almost be a sort of asceticism for a modern person to simply act according to every impulse that arose, because we are so used to suppressing our impulses or regulating them, or just having the impulse, something intercede and stop and check that impulse, which we would, the thing is, I can imagine those who have been listening to the podcast a long time might say, wait, are you saying there's some sort of intermediary force, some sort of free will perhaps, or some sort of rational, deliberative intermediary between our impulses and our actions? And Nietzsche would say no, because yet again, it's another impulse. He would say it's a fear impulse, an impulse of self-preservation, that this has learned to check the other impulses because of the ways in which, again, the collective morality or the collective law and order can punish you if your impulses cause you to do anything dangerous to the broader community, or that the broader community sees as forbidden or as a threat. And so that's what Nietzsche says. Specifically, the feeling of fear, that the thought of fear is able to suppress feelings, because, and the way that we develop this is by long generations of performing cruel and public punishments on human beings. That's what Nietzsche thinks the civilizing process basically consisted of. And so in any case, he wouldn't think that it was like a matter of free will, whether or not you act on an impulse or not. It's whether or not that impulse is stronger than your self-preservative instinct or not, or whether the self-preservative instinct that sort of checks your impulses judges that this impulse can be allowed to be fulfilled without bringing any threat to your own self-preservation. And so, this point is actually, again, we've discussed it quite a bit on the podcast, and it's fairly commonplace now, especially with Sigmund Freud and civilization and its discontents. It's widely accepted that there's something about becoming civilized animals that sort of created this division in the human psyche and this need to check our impulses in some way, and that this obviously was needed in order for society to exist at all, but it has downsides. It has ways that it deranges or imposes pathologies on the subject. And one of those, Nietzsche would say, is that we begin to experience our nature, what is unconscious in us, what comes from the instincts or impulses, or what we perceive as coming from the instincts or impulses, which are usually, Nietzsche would say everything is coming from the instincts or impulses, but there are some instincts or impulses that, again, fit in with the collective morality that help to preserve the species, at least from the perspective of the majority opinion, the collective opinion, and there are some instincts or impulses that do not. But in any case, we basically look at those which do not and call them evil, and this eventually results in the fact that every time we feel that we are being impulsive, every time we feel that an impulse is overwhelming, that we might experience it as guilt or fear or sort of the sting of conscience, whatever it might be, that ultimately is a sort of, again, a self-preservative impulse to act in accord with the morality of the community. Every time another impulse overwhelms that, it reinforces this idea. That's what's happening, is that the problem is our animalian instincts. That's how we experience it. That is one of those untamed instincts, one of those instincts of wild nature, once again, expressing itself. And so we begin to become distrustful of the body. We begin to consider, as he says, begin to say that every natural inclination is a sickness, something that disfigures, something that is downright infamous. And Nietzsche says, it's they, those who believe this, that have seduced us to hold that man's inclinations and instincts are evil. And again, it's not the point that all inclinations or instincts are good or something like that. It's rather that, once again, even all of our rationality, all of our egalitarian considerations or concern for the collective well-being or the commonwealth, all of these things, Nietzsche says, ultimately are also come from unconscious, impulsive, instinctual origins, that they are rarefactions, that they have been shaped and tamed over thousands of years of civilization, but that ultimately at the root is still the physiology. It's still the drives, the instincts. So, as the point he makes in Beyond Good and Evil, that the rarest and most beautiful things about human life come from the basest, most vicious origins. But there's also the point that, once again, the real situation that has happened is that these gregarious impulses or instincts, the instincts of the weak or the botched, whatever they might be, whatever is average or mediocre, these are the ones that have ended up becoming universalized. These are the ones that have become inculcated into the whole group, such that those who might have stronger, we might say, untamed impulses or animalian impulses have been seduced to suppress them or to feel guilt at the imagined evil character of their own nature. And I've brought this up many times, but this comes out in the Christian dichotomy of the soul and the flesh, or the spirit and the flesh, and the idea of the devil existing in the flesh just as the devil exists in the world, the sin being in our body in some sense, and the fact that upon being reborn in heaven, you'll be given even a new body that's free from sin and therefore free from death and all of these defects. But there was an intense distrust of nature, of human nature, but just the natural world in general, as sinful, really, in the Christian worldview. But this persists today, even with, sort of, again, a person who has a purely theoretical utilitarian view, to skip ahead to Thus Spoke Zarathustra, last man sort of moral view, who might not have any religious belief at all, and wouldn't say that the problem is that the flesh is of the devil. They might just say that, again, well, if you act on your impulses, that, rationally speaking, could be detrimental, it could be harmful to others, and if we're trying to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, then we do need to regulate our impulses, just as a rational, pragmatic consideration. And that, once again, Nietzsche would say it's the same fundamental valuation that's beneath that kind of claim, that's based on that same slander of nature, which really comes from the fact that we've had to civilize and tame mankind. It's really where it comes from. It's just that Christianity is sort of like a deranged expression of it in some sense. It takes many of these things that were already inherent to the process of civilization, takes them to the extreme. It makes Christianity a sort of a maximalist version that doesn't even permit that the instincts. I mean, one of the ways to think about this actually would be, Kaufman talks about this. He drew my attention to this dichotomy that Nietzsche draws between the way that he says in pagan cultures they would sort of propitiate their drives. They would allow the drive to express itself in certain contexts, to gorge, to feast, as it were, and that it would therefore purify and sharpen itself. You could indulge in the drive sort of guiltlessly and gluttonously in a certain time and place with a sort of regular rhythm. So on a holiday, right, you could have a gluttonous feast. And one of the things that people have said about the transition from the pagan world to the Christian world is from feasting to fasting, where it's sort of, of course, in later, Christianity, they still have feast days. So I'm not suggesting that went away. That would obviously be false. But, I suppose Nietzsche's argument would be the difference that he draws is that he calls it extirpation or castration. Sometimes he calls it emasculation. That's what Christianity fundamentally does to the drives that it opposes. It seeks to root them out. Now, can you really root out a drive? I would say no. It's just going to express itself in a deranged or pathological way. So, you're not going to root out the sex drive of human beings. You can throw filth at the origin of mankind, as Nietzsche says, right? Because sex is the origin of human reproduction. You can throw filth on it, associate it with guilt. You can forbid it in all sorts of contexts, except in very narrow ones. You can just make the expression of sexuality for sexuality's sake a forbidden thing, a shameful thing. Nietzsche would say that this, perhaps this is an attempt to extirpate the drive, completely sort of root it out, whereas the orgiastic Dionysian rituals allowed people to fully express all of these transgressive drives, the sex drive, the drive to cruelty, all in sort of one orgiastic frenzy. Nietzsche says they express the witch's brew of cruelty and sexuality. And so that allows the drive to not become deranged in some sense, not become pathological. It gets its satiety as part of that regular rhythm. That doesn't mean the Greeks allowed these things as a rule, right? They allowed it as an exception. and that's actually very, very important. That in many ways, Greek life, Roman life, the moral guidelines, the social mores that govern their lives were far more strict than anything that we live under, or even than what people lived under in the Christian Middle Ages. But they had certain rituals and certain times of the year where they were allowed to express all of these sort of normally very subversive or dangerous drives that presumably are part of just the human being on account of the fact that we are creatures of nature. And so there's a sort of deification of nature as well, because when a drive seizes you and you encounter anything that's beyond the power of humanity, right, you can sort of deify it into a god, becomes understood that way. And so I think that that's a very important distinction to understand, that there are different ways of sort of dealing with, again, vehement drives. It's also, I'd highly recommend looking up that passage in Daybreak. I also did a whole episode on that passage. But there's a way in which the extirpation of drives, I think, correlates with the slandering of nature, calling one's nature, one's natural impulses or instincts evil, calling nature itself evil, goes hand in hand with attempting to castrate or root out a drive. Whereas there are other ways of actually dealing with the drives. That it's not just a function of civilization. It is a particularly extreme maximalist value that comes with Christianity. And I think that's more or less covers it. So we'll go on to 295, which is entitled Brief Habits. Quote, I love brief habits and consider them as inestimable means for getting to know many things and states, down to the bottom of their sweetness and bitternesses. My nature is designed entirely for brief habits, even in the needs of my physical health, and altogether as far as I can see at all, from the lowest to the highest. I always believe that here is something that will give me lasting satisfaction. Brief habits, too, have this faith of passion, this faith in eternity, and that I am to be envied for having found and recognized it, and now it nourishes me at noon and in the evening, and spreads a deep contentment all around itself and deep into me, so that I desire nothing else, without having any need for comparisons, contempt, or hatred. But one day its time is up, the good thing parts from me, not as something that has come to nauseate me, but peacefully and sated with me as I am with it, as if we had reason to be grateful to each other as we shook hands to say farewell. Even then something new is waiting at the door, along with my faith, this indestructible fool and sage, that this new discovery will be just right, and that this will be the last time. That is what happens to me with dishes, ideas, human beings, cities, poems, music, doctrines, ways of arranging the day, and lifestyles. Enduring habits I hate. I feel as if a tyrant had come near me, and as if the air I breathe had thickened when events take such a turn that it appears that they will inevitably give rise to enduring habits. For example, owing to an official position, constant association with the same people, a permanent domicile, or unique good health. Yes, at the very bottom of my soul, I feel grateful to all my misery and bouts of sickness and everything about me that is imperfect, because this sort of thing leaves me with 100 back doors through which I can escape from my enduring habits. Most intolerable, to be sure, and the terrible par excellence would be, for me, a life entirely devoid of habits, a life that would demand perpetual improvisation. That would be my exile and my Siberia." End quote. So there's a lot here that's just about Nietzsche as a man. And, you know, we've spoken about this before in the read-throughs of The Gay Science, of the importance of Nietzsche's own health and sickness, and the fact that as a result of this, he seems to have this sort of dynamic life, this fluctuating life. And we're going to get into this a lot more when we start talking about Klosowski's interpretation of Nietzsche, how he had these discontinuous states, how he experienced himself as, many of the ways that Nietzsche speaks about the relation of the impulses to thought, that there's not this unified core of the self, but rather that there are many forces, many drives that form a complex of the self, which are not identical to one another. And so you could look at it as though the sick Nietzsche the convalescent Nietzsche, the healthy Nietzsche are all sort of different people in some sense. Or, as Nietzsche says, he forms these different short habits, brief habits of thought or of living. He says this is what happens to him with dishes, ideas, human beings, cities, poems, music, doctrines, ways of arranging the day, and lifestyles. That all of these are sort of different eras that he goes through that are discontinuous, that there is a disunity or a discontinuity or a non-identity between them. And this also plays into Nietzsche's idea of the mask. We sort of present this mask, the ego consciousness. The mask is really suggesting a sort of unity to the person that is not really there. Now, on the other hand, it may be the case that there are certain people that have these enduring habits that Nietzsche says he would sort of avoid like the plague, but we might think of a type like Kant. Nietzsche bears many similarities to Kant in terms of, if you look at their daily habits, they're both committed walkers, people who will walk every single day. They'll commit themselves to a schedule. But notice that that's, again, a sort of an era of Nietzsche's life when he's living in Sils Maria. But then he'll change from season to season. The fact that Nietzsche is a sort of a migratory bird of a philosopher, because he's always looking for the ideal temperature or climate for his condition. And so he'll spend his summers in the Swiss Alps and then spend his winters in northern Italy, and he'll change his habits according to where he is and the new shape that his life has taken. We might also think of his university career. There's that quote from one of Nietzsche's letters where he says that somebody, this is like in the mid-1880s, where he's left the university and he's written Thus Spoke Zarathustra by this point. He has a very different self-image from the way he thought of himself as a classical philologist. And he says, somebody the other day mentioned, Herr Professor Friedrich Nietzsche, the devil take him. What does that character have to do with me? He's talking about himself from a past life, like it's a different person almost. And so while this passage may seem to just be a series of personal statements about Nietzsche himself, we might say that his experience of himself as these discontinuous states, as almost these different people, as this multiplicity of drives that can sort of supersede one another, overcome one another, rule for a brief period, and then give way to a different personality almost. And again, another thing that Nietzsche says, which we'll get to when we get to the end of this book with the aphorism, the greatest weight, about the eternal return. What the demon says in that aphorism is that if this thought took hold of you, it would make you other than you are. And indeed, in Ecce Homo, Nietzsche speaks of how the thought of the eternal return was experienced by him as transformative. So even these thoughts, which could just, again, be like an inversion of a high intensity or tonality of the soul, of a strong impulse, a strong feeling, however we want to understand the nature of thought, if we understand it in a Nietzschean manner or not, that even sort of an idea can transform the kind of person that you are. And we might also consider, Nietzsche's relationship to Wagner, how he saw himself as sort of a different person, both in sort of like being a subordinate or a disciple, or Wagner is his mentor, someone that he looks up to. It's also a period where he's Schopenhauerian. It's also a period where he's a romantic. Even by the end of his university career, he had come to craft a different self-image and rebel against that earlier self-image that he had formed as a Wagnerian. And so, Nietzsche, the way that he sort of passes through multiple convictions, through multiple ways of life, multiple habits. It's very interesting, right? He's not just speaking about personal ideologies. I've sort of brought those up to some extent, but he's focusing on the way in which not just our ideas, but our behaviors change. And that a repeated behavior, one which endures, at least for a time, it becomes something, again, like a habit. By drilling it into yourself over and over again, by repeating the same experience over and over again, that creates a certain, again, tonality or a certain vibe or a certain era of your life. And I mean, for my part, I think it's true. I think that for the most part, people are not consistent, and that the consistency that we impose upon our personality is at least somewhat false. We may be, for a variety of reasons, compelled to think of ourselves that way and to try and drum that consistency into ourselves as much as possible. Again, part of the civilizing process. Because, ultimately the polity, the collective morality that governs it, wants consistent individuals. Even if such a thing doesn't exist, we have to masquerade as that to whatever degree possible. And there are certain, physiologies, we might say, that are more amenable to that. Again, people like Kant, who they can settle into a certain groove, a certain enduring habit, and just stay there. It's interesting, though, that again, there's like these one or two sentences at the end where Nietzsche says, the most terrible thing would be no habits at all, at least for him. And again, we might think of this contrast he's drawn between he who sees nature as totally chaotic, wild, and free versus he who sees the necessity and the patterns and the lawfulness of nature. That even here, in describing himself as a sort of flux, it's not a totally chaotic flux. It's not one in which there's, we might say just like total discontinuity. It's like periods of brief continuity that supersede one another, that overcome one another in a sort of procession. But this total freedom, this total chaos would, he says, be my exile in my Siberia. To demand, as he says, perpetual improvisation, to constantly have to improvise who you are in every moment, to be... So Nietzsche's free spirit has never indicated that sort of thing, has never indicated a sort of flitting, sort of almost like the person just becomes nothingness and sand at that point. And at the very least, again, there's nothing in this passage that suggests this as a moral dictum. It's Nietzsche describing himself to us. And that's very much par for the course in the gay science and in Nietzsche's work, that he's trying to make a point about the nature of the self without necessarily, he's saying this is who I am. He's not saying this is how you ought to be, even if he might have a value judgment to make about different types of physiology. We might even say this involves tempo once again, this passage. It involves the rate of change or the rate of duration that is experienced or revealed by the subject. Again, not necessarily in like the ideas or thoughts they have or their self-image, but in their habits, what kind of person they actually are, the personality as it's embodied. Because what is the personality that's experienced by those around you, by the external world, other than the way that you act, and the way then that you act repeatedly, not just random acts that you may carry out that don't correlate or correspond to anything, but your habits, right? This is it's a very interesting way of looking at the human being. So let's move on. Let's go to 296. Quote, a firm reputation. A firm reputation used to be extremely useful, and wherever society is still dominated by the herd instinct, it is still more expedient for everyone to pretend that his character and occupation are unchangeable, even if at bottom they are not. One can depend on him. He remains the same. In all extremities of society, this is the sort of praise that means the most. Society is pleased to feel that the virtue of this person, the ambition of that one, and the thoughtfulness and passion of the third provide it with a dependable instrument that is always at hand. Society honors this instrumental nature, this way of remaining faithful to oneself, this unchangeability of views, aspirations, and even faults, and lavishes its highest honors upon it. Such esteem, which flourishes and has flourished everywhere, alongside the morality of mores, breeds character, and brings all change, all relearning, all self-transformation into ill repute. However great the advantages of this way of thinking may be elsewhere, for the search after knowledge, no general judgment could be more harmful, for precisely the goodwill of those who seek knowledge to declare themselves at any time dauntlessly against their previous opinions, and to mistrust everything that wishes to become firm in us is thus condemned and brought into ill repute. Being at odds with a firm reputation, the attitude of those who seek knowledge is considered dishonorable, while the petrification of opinions is accorded a monopoly on honor. Under the spell of such notions, we have to live to this day. How hard is it to live when one feels the opposition of many millennia all around? It is probable that the search after knowledge was afflicted for many millennia with a bad conscience, and that the history of the greatest spirits must have contained a good deal of self-contempt and secret misery." End quote. So many of the things that I've talked about in my analysis of the aphorisms leading up to this one already cover many of the things that Nietzsche says here in interpretation. You can probably get most of this from much of the previous analysis that we've done. And again, it just shows that these are not randomly arranged sections. There is a definite flow to the points that Nietzsche is making here. And so remember earlier when we were talking about all those evil, unhappy, exceptional people, that Nietzsche says what is needful is not pity for them. What I hope that they do is find their own sun that shines on them in their way of life, right? And we should keep that in mind when he says this at the end, that the greatest spirits throughout history have contained a good deal of self-contempt and secret misery. That also involves his observation that morality is not heroic because the collective morality is imposed on everyone all the time, from voices within, from voices without, by the very real, concrete consequences that can befall people from deviating too much from the public morality, the herd morality. And so Nietzsche brings that in here at the end, that this has been the bad conscience placed upon thought, because thought actually requires the willingness to transgress boundaries, the willingness to go beyond, to call into question even the public morality. What thought really requires, what thinking requires, is bravery. It requires the willingness to move into, to explore, to wander in forbidden country. But here one of the things he brings up is that thought transforms. And again, we might think of the transformative nature of the thought of the eternal return, or Nietzsche's statements going all the way back to Human All Too Human, again about passing through many convictions, and that convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies, and that, it's not about the courage of having a conviction. What is needful is courage for an attack upon one's own convictions. So to attack the self-image that you previously held, because our convictions, right, we're not just talking about the beliefs, random beliefs you might happen to hold, but beliefs that you associate with yourself as part of your identity. Often valuations about life, fundamental value judgments, which have a great deal to do with your identity as a person. What happens when you turn about and attack that? In a way, you're turning about and attacking yourself, your previous self, as a means of effecting a transformation into a new kind of self. You have to attack, critique, and destroy, really, before you can move on to something new, before you can level the ground for a new creation. And most of the rest of the passage is about what we've already talked about, or what he implied in the previous passage, and I already sort of discussed, that society very much imposes that firm reputation. The man of enduring habits is incredibly useful to society, and that even his faults, even aspects of the personality that might be suboptimal, it's preferred that they be enduring, that we know what we're dealing with when we deal with a certain person, because again, having everyone be a known quantity, having the individual be understood as a consistent thing, as a coherent thing, that's very important for all of our systems of law and justice. It would be the movie Identity contains that notion or that question, right? If the person that you're punishing, it's a movie, it's a horror film. I'm going to spoil it, but it's about a serial killer who has like 12 different multiple identities, and the identities sort of kill each other in this simulacrum of his own inner torment or strife as part of a psychological treatment. And the killer, the part of his identity, the personality within him that actually committed the crimes, is eventually killed or overcome by the other personalities. And that personality, that the only personality that remains, right, in the end, if the doctor, the psychiatrist, or psychologist maybe, I don't remember, he poses the question, if the person who actually committed the crime from among these multiple personalities is dead, quote unquote, if that personality no longer exists, if this is a completely different person now, is he really the one who still committed the same crime? You're punishing the body, but not the mind. It's really the mind that commits the crime, right? And of course, there's a twist at the end. If you seen the film, you know that the person who he thought was the killer is not actually the killer. So we don't have to go into all of that. But it's in raising that question, right? What if this image of the individual were true, where we could have 12 or maybe even 50 or 100 or thousands of multiple quote-unquote personalities, sub-personality complexes within ourselves that were not consistent, that they just sort of seize or take hold of the body at a given time, and then another one comes in and supersedes them and seizes it. Could you really hold anyone accountable for anything? I mean, if you actually accept that model of the human being, it would be almost impossible to hold anyone accountable for anything, other than you could say, well, we could still practice justice as a kind of deterrence. We could still practice, but would that even work, right? Because you might deter the more responsible personalities within the person or sub-personalities, and not deter perhaps a personality that momentarily seizes and takes hold and commits a crime and then flees and then leaves, right? If we really accept that view of discontinuous states at the root of the person and the body as, just holding these multiple minds, and the mind is the true person under the way that we tend to think about the human being under these moral regimes of society, well, I mean, can you really have justice? So there's all of these incentives for not only thinking about the human being as a consistent, coherent, stable personality, as one personality, and for, to whatever degree possible, trying to shape and mold them actually into that, even if that isn't always the case, even if we all acknowledge, people sort of have multiple sides to them. We have different ways of talking about it where we kind of obfuscate the issue, that, people can sort of be taken hold of by a strong emotion or have a psychotic break or episode, a fugue state, any number of things that can happen where you are not yourself, right? But for the most part, we try and shape people into being a consistent personality to whatever degree, again, possible. Maybe it's not possible to ever totally get there, but Nietzsche sort of suggests, again, Kant, it's very interesting that Kant is perhaps one of the most consistent, one of the most reliable, we might say one of the most boring personalities ever to have lived, one of the most autistic people who has to have everything exactly the same every single day, that you can set your watch by his walks, right? What does Kant do philosophically? Well, he produces a moral philosophy that essentially says the collective morality is right, and the collective views and judgments on reality, metaphysically, are right. Even if, we're proving it through reason now rather than revelation, turns out all of the views of the herd, of the collective, that everyone already believes are correct. So Kant philosophically becomes a very useful, dependable instrument, and that's exactly his personality, and that's mirrored in his philosophy. But even the idea that, again, that the criminal is a consistent, coherent, stable personality, again, is very useful because then it's just when we execute the criminal. And therefore Nietzsche says, that we need to feel that this person with his thoughtfulness and passion, or that person with his ambition, or this person with his virtue, even if those traits may they be positive or negative, society very much wishes to impose that, wishes to impose the illusion or the perception of that if it doesn't exist. But I think Nietzsche is saying it's also trying to bring that into being. And through what? Well, through conditioning, through habit. We habitually associate ourselves with this ego consciousness, which is writing these post hoc rationalization sort of stories that bring everything into a coherent narrative. And by associating ourselves with that rather than the body or the impulses or instincts, that's all evil nature again, right? We establish this idea that you need to have a firm reputation, that we beat that into humankind, just like we beat everything else, everything good that we've ever teased out of the human animal, in Nietzsche's view, has been achieved by these awful bloody means, all the bloody tortures that society has had to engage in order to produce human beings who can promise and be consistent and remember themselves. All of this is very, very interesting to analyze with the especially the second essay, I believe, of the Genealogy of Morals. Yeah, the second essay. Okay, let's go to 297. We're just going to do a couple more aphorisms today. 297, quote, "The ability to contradict Everybody knows nowadays that the ability to accept criticism and contradiction is a sign of high culture. Some people actually realize that higher human beings desire and provoke contradiction in order to receive some hint about their own injustices of which they are as yet unaware. But the ability to contradict, the attainment of a good conscience when one feels hostile to what is accustomed, traditional, and hallowed, that is still more excellent and constitutes what is really great, new, and amazing in our culture. This is the step of steps of the liberated spirit. Who knows that? End quote. So, for all of the shade that Nietzsche throws against modernity, modern society, our metropolitan, cosmopolitan, sort of gregarious modern society, our liberal societies with all of these new ideas calling into question, challenging the traditional views, what we're accustomed to, that which is hallowed, which is considered sacred. Again, this is, I guess, kind of relating back to the previous passage, but, again, it's like that gregarious set of valuations, the herd valuations, really depend on that firmness, that consistency, and we can see that in the way they hallow things and make them sacred. Remember, that's what Nietzsche says all morality comes from, right? That which was previously an I will. So something that came out of an impulse or an instinct, a value judgment that comes out of life, which is initially irrational, unjust, as arbitrary as anything else that arises out of nature, by being practiced and venerated for a long time, begins to be seen as an enduring fact. It's sort of deprived of its initial emotional intensity. It sort of becomes debased like a coin that has had its image rubbed off of it, or magma that's hardened into rock. But that's the nature of all of our tablets of value. Were previously an expression of will that have become hardened and rigidified. And what does that is these long traditions of veneration, when people venerate something for a very long time to the point where they don't even know where the origin of it was, where it just seems to have existed since time immemorial. And so that just came to mind. That's really, again, more a comment on the previous aphorism, but when he says, one feels hostile to what's accustomed, traditional, and hallowed. It's, I think, very important to consider what that means when something becomes hallowed. But in any case, so we've already talked about how Nietzsche says it's a very positive thing to be able to have an attack on one's own convictions. This was his belief as far back as Human All Too Human, but here he says it's equally good, or it's even better, to be able to attack yourself, to be able to contradict others, to be able to contradict those traditional values of the society. And then that's actually a good thing with the liberalization, the cosmopolitanization of society, the fact that we are attacking and overthrowing these old idols. And so Nietzsche is certainly a critic of modernity. I would never claim otherwise. He's certainly a critic of the gregarious modern bourgeois society that's created in modernity. But, once again, it's so important to understand that key phrase from Beyond Good and Evil, that it's a prelude to the philosophy of the future, that he wants philosophers of the future, and that the self-overcoming of modernity will be just that. It will not be a simple-minded rejection, which Nietzsche calls explicitly. You can look up the video I did called Nietzsche's 5 No's, the things that Nietzsche attacks. He says this explicitly. His philosophy is not aimed at a romantic return to the way that things were in the past. It's simply not. He doesn't think that that's possible, for one. He doesn't think that it's, what would we say? It's denying all the reality of everything that's happened since that time and the necessity of all of those things happening, right? If this scientific revolution has happened that has desacralized the world, and if this industrial revolution has happened that is, harnessing these forces of production and breaking down these old dynastic interests, and if man has become, with the Enlightenment, more spiritual, maybe Christianity makes us more spiritual. The Enlightenment turns that into maybe a more intellectualized culture, one that associates more with the mind than the body. In spite of the fact that Nietzsche wants to draw our attention to everything that we've lost, and the fact that he thinks it is a fundamentally erroneous view of the human being that we've developed in modernity, and that there are all these false premises within our morality that we hold in the modern day. Well, look, There are false premises in every morality. There's an error in everything that human beings do. And the point for Nietzsche is never, okay, so throw it all away and go back. You have to understand the necessity of why man was driven to do these things, and that there must have been a real need. There must have been something in the fate of mankind that we would proceed down this road of a mechanistic, intellectualized, over-socialized society. So how do we overcome that? How do we move beyond? I mean, a Marxist would say sublation, or a Hegelian would say sublation. And Nietzsche doesn't necessarily think that, he doesn't think we're going to necessarily achieve this overcoming by a synthesis of opposites, or by, what might we say, that there's always a positive sort of, that there's always a goal within these overcomings that's proceeding towards some end, as Hegel does, or as the Marxists do. There's a great passage in Beyond Good and Evil, again, where Nietzsche talks about the metaphor of taking a few steps back, but as the prelude to a great leap, the way that somebody who's about to jump might take a few steps back. They don't start their jump from right at the edge of a precipice, right? You want to have a running start, so you might have to back up a few steps before you take your leap. I think that really is the nature of Nietzsche's engagement with the past. It's not romanticism. He's drawing upon the past, upon, as he calls, the fading voice of an old era and the truths that they knew, which, and even the errors that they possessed, in order to take a leap into the future. That is really his concern. And so in any case, Nietzsche is perfectly capable of saying, these developments within this culture may have paved the way for that great revaluation, right? The fact that we're able to contradict that there are no sacred cows anymore, the desacralization of the world, for all the danger it brings, as he brings up in the God is Dead passage, is also the greatest opportunity we've ever had. So for all the sickness of modernity, the gregariousness, all these things we've talked about, the fact that we can cultivate men who can be critical, who can contradict. Yes, many of them will simply use that for, they'll just become the Reddit atheists. They'll just become the, they'll just become the people who say, well, actually, about everything, and they'll be, or source, all of these tropes about the over-intellectualized, sort of silly type of person who can't see basic facts that are right in front of his face because he needs a source for it or something like that. Yeah, those types of people will be cultivated too. But they're not the point of the process, right? Any sort of system, any culture, any set of valuations, any tablet of values, any sort of hothouse for producing types of human beings is going to mostly produce failures. But we're not concerned with that. Nature is wasteful. It's squandering. You get a few successes out of your experiment. Most of them will be failures. And so the ability to contradict, you can see that as, I wish we were yet again in a culture of unquestioning sort of mental subordination to these mystical principles, where we could just be tough, vitalist barbarians and not think about any of these issues. I'd rather have beauty and brawn than brains or something like that. Well, that's not Nietzsche's position. He thinks it's a good thing that we've developed these capacities. That's really, again, what this whole book is about. The self-overcoming of science, of the scientism worldview, by science itself, not by romantic irrationalism, or however he's characterized, sometimes by his enemies and sometimes even by his friends. All right, the last aphorism we'll talk about today is 298. It's entitled, Sigh. Quote, I caught this insight on the way and quickly seized the rather poor words that were closest to hand to pin it down, lest it fly away again. And now it has died of these arid words, and shakes and flaps in them. And I hardly know any more, when I look at it, how I could ever have felt so happy when I caught this bird. End quote. Nietzsche often talks about thoughts as birds, because they're little fleeting, flitting things that one has to grab hold of. Zarathustra, I believe, has a passage. Yes, it's in this book, Zarathustra, where he talks about all of the birds in his birdhouse. And sometimes there's a bird that doesn't really belong to him there. That's sort of just flown in. That's not really his. He can't really lay claim to it, which is a very interesting thing, because it's this different picture of thought or of thinking that Nietzsche has. That thought doesn't think by itself. It's not a product that just comes out, that's made by the ego consciousness out of an act of its will, as though it were, again, like a voluntarily governing force, like the way God speaks the world into existence with the logos. That's a fundamentally false vision or picture of thought. Thought is seized on by differing forces within the self that then express themselves. And so then that's the notion within Zarathustra. Occasionally, a thought can come in that's really coming from outside, that really doesn't belong to you. What does that mean? Well, it could be a thought from the herd or collective morality that is sort of forcing its way into your birdhouse with the other birds. Or it could be a thought that you think is particularly enticing or seductive, even if you don't have a right to it in terms of your habits, the way that you live your life. It doesn't reflect any truth. It's not a truth that you can live or embody, so it might not really belong to you, or you're not ready to deal with the consequences of that thought. But here what Nietzsche talks about is, so I seized upon this thought, this fleeting, flittering thing, and then I used whatever words were available to me in the moment. So I'm having this high tonality of the soul, right? This intensity of sort of, just one of those moments when you say, you have almost, there are times when you spend a lot of time thinking where you almost have more of the simulacrum of a thought or the image of a thought or the idea of a thought than the actual thought itself, where you feel the feeling or the vibe, or you see like the total picture, but you almost can't put it into specific individual words, where the thought is almost so big that it can't be adequately encompassed, or it's so personal to you. It's a feeling perhaps that you have, but that you don't know if it can ever be put into words of the other feelings that people talk about. Or it's a kind of, you might say, like a perception about a given phenomenon that you've never heard anyone else articulate. And sometimes you grab hold of it, but it's always a fleeting thing. And David Lynch talks about this, right? He talks about how whenever he has a thought for a story idea or something like that, I'm speaking of him in the present tense, even though he's dead, but David Lynch will always be alive, so there's that. But he says that, whenever he doesn't write a thought down, it almost always goes away. And that's an amazing thing too, if we think about it. Why isn't our mind like a storehouse of our thoughts? If they're really things that we create that really belong to us, why is it that they are so fleeting and that they're subject to forgetting? That we could have an apparently very profound thought or a amazing story idea, and then it's gone the next day, or you can't. It's like a dream. When you wake up from a dream, if you don't write it down immediately, usually the details begin to flee from you very quickly. It's like your mind is just evacuating the contents of it. And David Lynch would also talk about thoughts as animals. He used a very different metaphor, but it's very similar. It's different in that it addresses itself to the depths rather than the heights. So he would talk about fish swimming in his pond, about an idea being like catching a fish, laying hold of this sort of slippery sort of thing darting through the dark waters of the unconscious. Whereas Nietzsche is talking about birds flying through the air that one snatches out of the sky. So very similar and yet different at the same time. But that's really all Nietzsche's talking about here. That not just the fleetingness of thought, but that sometimes you can't find the words that are adequate to give voice to that thought. To where, and part of this is because, again, that difference between gregarious and singular, that Nietzsche thinks what's best in us, what is most profound in us is totally singular, is totally peculiar to the individual. It's something almost incommunicable. And you have to kind of hack language in order to even talk about it at all. And much of Nietzsche's philosophy and his style of coming down on both sides, showing the contradictions that are contained even within words, where we confound contradictory or different things, non-identical things under one label. We're using these oxymoronic phrases. All of this is an attempt in a way to hack language in order to communicate the incommunicable, the feelings, the states, the thoughts that he had that are not really, there's no ready-made word or concept for them. And sometimes because in the act of trying to catch that peculiar thought, that's peculiar only to you, and all you have is the dust and nonsense of the gregarious language that everyone speaks, of the common language that doesn't have a concept for what it's like you have to fashion it anew on this foundation of sand. And sometimes you can't work fast enough. You can't create the edifice, the vessel that can contain the vessel of words that can contain that fleeting thought. You can't build the birdhouse fast enough. And when you revisit that thought, it's dissatisfying. You look at your words and you say to yourself, I thought this was the most brilliant thing when I experienced it, but when I look at it now, it seems wanting. And, as a final consideration, we might think about that passage from Beyond Good and Evil, one of the last ones in the book, signaling the coming end of the book, where Nietzsche speaks about similar issues, that upon looking back at all of his words, about all of my painted and written thoughts, all of these attempts to arrange and articulate and codify, reify my thought into this stable, we might say, like an enduring habit or like a firm reputation, to take those thoughts, those wills, those instincts, those impulses that seized upon ideas and rigidify them, to hallow them in the manner that the previous religions hallowed their thou shalts. Nietzsche certainly does that in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And it's at the end of Beyond Good and Evil, another one of his books, where he sort of allows himself a little lapse to question whether or not he's adequately done so. That every time you look back on one of your great works of art or philosophy, there's always a dissatisfaction that the feeling that I had, the thoughts that I had, were really truly incommunicable. And this is the best that I could do, in some sense. Doesn't mean that you can't do it better than other times, or some expressions might be better than others, or more evocative or communicative than others. But there's always that dissatisfaction, because our thoughts are just like fleeting birds at the end of the day. And that very much resonates with me. I've had this experience many times in writing and in my art. And I've spent a whole musical career trying to communicate feelings that I don't think there are words for. And I don't know if I've ever succeeded, really. But so we end this edition of our gay science walkthrough with a sigh, right? That's the name of that final aphorism. It's never really communicated. We never really are able to give a true voice to that in us, which is the most profound and most unique to us. And just another personal confession from Nietzsche, but it ties in with, again, all of these themes that we've talked about throughout this episode. Thank you for joining me, everyone. I've had a lot of fun with this one. We're still coming up on many, I can still say the best is yet to come with many of the aphorisms here in Book 4 of the Gay Science. And so I'm very much looking forward to it. We're about to finish. Once we finish Book 4, that will be the end of the main corpus, the 1882 era corpus of the Gay Science. And we're going to take a whole season off before we get back to the Gay Science Book 5, because that was the material from 1886. And so we'll revisit it then at the end of season 6. So we've got a few more episodes, and then we'll set aside the Gay Science for a while. But it's such a wonderful climax, Book 4 of the Gay Science. So, God, what a journey it's been. All right. Thank you, everybody. Please join me next time. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.